Week 9 of the PhD, just keeping up the regular blog, deep into the literature review at this point. So figured I'd run through some of the major findings out of that recently, because that's probably the most relevant thing to bring to light at this point. I will do stuff about ethics and power dynamics at a later time, but for now, this is where my head's at, and there have been some very interesting developments in that time frame. So, particular note, been doing a lot of research in sovereign citizens recently, looking into the pathology and the different compounding factors there, and their propensity for violence, which is actually very minimal, as it turns out. They're quite distinct from other extremist networks in the sense that they're very much reactive as opposed to proactive. So compared to the other two focal groups, I've got neo-Nazis and Islamic extremists, both of which have a history of planning attacks and going out and committing said attacks. Sovereign citizens, by and large, even when they are violent, which is quite rare, is reactive. They tend to set traps. So, for example, the biggest obvious one at the moment with the shooting of the police officer in Victoria by Dizzy Freeman, I think, I can't remember his name, the Freeman fella up in northern Victoria. He waited till they came to his property, at which point he was prepared to shoot at them, as opposed to going to a police station and attempting to bomb it or shoot it up or something along those lines. Nearly all incidents of violence involving sovereign citizens involve them being approached by police and responding or being prepared to respond. Even when they're non-violent, most of their interactions go that way. It's very much a leave me alone sort of movement as opposed to the more we want to reshape society movement. It's interesting, quite compelling. Not too surprising. Turns out their fundamental motivation, when you get right down to it, for sovereign citizens is financial instability, which goes a long way to explaining the weird grab bag of rationalizations and pseudo law and ideology that they pull on, and the incredible diversity of that movement, because fundamentally they're looking for ways out of financial insecurity as opposed to a coherent view of how the world should be. Been looking at artificial intelligence use, that Hedaya paper again by extremist networks and potential counteractions to that. Beyond that, been looking at the old Bolt case. Yeah, there's a nice article on that. The freedom of speech and racial vilification in Australia, the Bolt case. Similar to that, I didn't get a lot out of that beyond the fairly obvious but now documented point that the Bolt case quickly stopped being about the facts of the matter. Interesting point about that is that I didn't realize this till reading this study was that the ruling against Andrew Bolt for racially vilifying those Indigenous people didn't actually say that he wasn't allowed to talk about it at all. Of course, that didn't stop him from claiming that, hence going with the freedom of speech angle and all that sort of nonsense. Where in reality, it was just, no, you just need to print a retraction in the paper. So the point being is that it wasn't about freedom of speech. It was about power. They took that opportunity and the right wing ran with it. More compellingly, David Lowe's 2022 far-right extremism is it legitimate freedom of expression, hate crime or terrorism, which goes through and does a pretty excellent job of looking at how hate speech works in multiple jurisdictions, all within the English-speaking word, but we only speak so many languages. So looking at that, and that's very interesting, looking at how different countries define that concept and also what the limitations on that concept are. Also, their freedom of speech legislation or lack thereof, and what the limits are on that. And the obvious takeaway there is that there's always limitations, significant limitations, which are obvious as soon as you start looking at it. I mean, yeah, defamation being the obvious one. Beyond that, we're looking at one of the major takeaways from that, from a PhD perspective, is that the legal response is not going to be viable for us. Looking at that from a regulatory point of view, one, it's too slow. Two, it's too patchy. Three, it's going to alter across international levels. So, plus, it's a bit ambitious for a PhD student to expect as a result of their 3-year project. This is, yeah, so we're looking at more of a policy-based response, would be my guess, and collaboration through the field. Interesting additional study here from REC from 2021, fighting hate speech laws in Germany, particularly. So Germany has obviously got a reputation for being incredibly strict about neo-Nazi commentary or language, and massively limiting freedom of speech around those topics. Rightly or debatably, rightly so, but understandably so, given the the Nazi history and so forth. So What was done with they're looking into a relatively new bit of legislation over there called the Nets DG, which is a so basically required self-regulation by social media platforms that they had 24 hours to respond when something got flagged as anti-Semitic or otherwise hate speech, and had to remove it or judge it in any case. And they were allowed with, I think it was, what was it, 2 weeks? Oh, they were allowed for a week if it was unclear if it was illegal or not. So they put 50 million euro fines on these companies per post for non-compliance. So that made it pretty bloody straightforward. There's are, however, a lot of criticisms of this approach and the limitations of this approach. They compared that against, for example, Taiwan's approach of a more comprehensive response, which would be to promote constructive messages or counter messages or so forth. Pre-bunking is a common tactic. And yeah, so yeah, interesting to look at that. Again, hardline regulations probably not for us, but it is interesting to know what's out there. By far the most interesting one this week, however, has been The Social Construction of Extremism by J.M. Berger in 2024. That is a seminal text. I can't believe it was only published in 2024. It's so unbelievably fundamental to this entire thing. A good question that got raised by one of my supervisors was simply, what's your definition of extremism? Which my answer at the time was, well, we'll find out when I do my literature review. But now that I'm doing it, this is it. Um, Berger goes through a variety of different definitions of extremism, and they're all problematic, all deeply problematic. A lot of the time because they ignore power in particular, or have very minimal or simplistic definitions that just don't cover obvious examples of extremism. The extreme one example he uses is, for example, is slavery in the US and the movements that were built around rationalizing that at the time. His point being that is it not extremism just because it was the mainstream? It's still an obviously unethical position, no matter what time period you're looking at. So, and yes, it's a social norm of the time, whoop-de-doo. We can talk about the ethics of that another time. But the thing is that just because they're the powerful group, just because they're in charge, again, Nazis being an obvious example in Germany, 1930s and 40s, are they not still extreme? So his definition for extremism is, oops, sorry, long file, was simply, where have I put it? The problem with so many damn notes. Oh yeah. The belief that an in-group's success or survival can never be separated from the need for hostile action against an outgroup, which is interesting. It is very, very heavily focused around in-groups and out-groups, and he breaks that concept down into several further layers, all of which are quite compelling. But the definition in and of itself, particularly you got the in-groups and the out-groups, but defining the in-group by their success or survival is fundamentally based around the need for hostile action against an outgroup. And where that lands you is that the a extremist group cannot exist without an outgroup and violence against that outgroup. It is in fact defined by its violence against that outgroup and the need for constant struggle. This will sound very familiar for anyone who's been keeping tabs on fascism over the last decade or so, and the old definition around fascism constantly needs an enemy. It's constantly shrinking the in-group because no matter how successful it is, no matter how effective it is in wiping out its enemies, it can't exist without an enemy. It has to have someone to fight. And therefore, even when it is successful, again, Nazis, so on and so forth, debatably is sort of seeing this happen now in the US. Even once you've gotten rid of the out group, you'll just start shrinking the in group because you need to be at war. Extremism, again, based on the success or survival of the in group, can never be separated from the need for hostile action against an out group. Now, for our three target audiences, Islamic extremism, excellent example of this, right? They're defined by their enemies, the constant jihad, the need to attack constantly ideological enemies and anyone, really. It doesn't really matter because fundamental to this definition is that it's not really about the out group. It's about a need to define the in group by using an out group. Neo-Nazis are exactly the same. They're constant shifting ideological nonsense, but the point is that anyone who's not us is the enemy, and we can only preserve us by being at war with the enemy. Whether this actually improves the circumstances of anyone in the in-group doesn't actually matter. It's all about defining that. Now, Berger had an interesting concept here of ontological uncertainty, which is, for those who are not familiar with those terms, ontology is just the study of what is real. And therefore, ontological uncertainty in this context means just think of it as uncertainty. Who are you? Who am I? What is real? What is my role in society? What is society? What is a good community? What is not a good community? An existential crisis, basically. And he's saying that extremism is predicated on that, a need to fill that hole. However, very interesting in his conclusion, he notes that while it draws people based on that premise, it draws people based on a need for ontological certainty, it never provides it. And it can't provide it because if it ever does, the whole point of the extremism evaporates. Again, that constant need to be at war. So they need to, it's actually quite a difficult balancing act. An extremist group needs to give the impression that it can provide ontological certainty, but it can never actually do it. So you've got to keep people wanting more, but you can never satisfy them and you can never give them to never let them lose hope either. So it really is a real tough morale problem, which is probably in part why the need for constant hostile action, right? Keep people doing things, keep them busy, stop them from thinking about anything else. So, yeah, very, very, very compelling. Now, from the PhD's perspective, this was particularly useful for me because this gives us a lot of potential vectors for attack. So again, the whole point of the idea of the PhD is to develop responses to this. It's starting to help me break down the levels within a group, so within an extremist group. So you got your in-group, the people that identify and are identified as by that extremist group, the good ones, so to speak, the chosen people. Then you've got your eligible in-group, people that are nominally of that group. So for neo-Nazis, that's white people, pure white people, blah, blah, blah. The Nazis are the in-group. The eligible in-group is purebred white people. Again, this terminology, Jesus. And then you've got your out-group. Now, oh, you're sorry, ineligible in-group. The people that are nominally part of your group that are not acceptable, that are out. So that would be your race traitors for your white people, people like myself. And then you have your out group, which is anyone who's never going to be part of that group for self-evident reasons within that ideology. So non-white people, basically. So these are your different layers. Then you've got potential angles of attack here, and there's a concept he's come up with called the in-group prototype, which is the idea against which the in-group is judged. And the eligible in-group either aspires to or gets rejected from and put into that ineligible in-group. So that is a weak point because if you can disrupt that in-group prototype, if you can cause enough disruption to that's defined as, how do you process, right? How can you determine who the in-group is or not? Another observation from his work is that those the extremist groups spend nearly as much time, if not more time, fighting their own in-groups or eligible in-groups or their own comrades, as it were, than they do fighting the out-group. So that's an interesting point. I'm wondering about that. I'm still not sure whether that's a potential avenue of attack, of fostering that infighting, using the AI to cast doubt as to who, basically the purity test attack of causing infighting by accusing different groups of being not part of the actual in-group. It's a thought. I don't know if that gets past human research ethics, but it's a thought. Other ones, though, the ontological uncertainty is actually potentially a very, very powerful line of attack here because that's the sort of stuff that any ethicist deals with constantly, right? Any student of ethics can navigate ontological uncertainty with no problems whatsoever. It's half the reason the field exists. On the other hand, your average person cannot. They're not even familiar with the concept. Everyone experiences it, but they're not necessarily comfortable with it, right? So, or don't have the language or the framework necessary to move through it. So by fostering ontological uncertainty inside those networks, we may disrupt them because they have to give the impression that they can fulfill that ontological uncertainty. If you point out their complete inability to do so, there might be an angle of attack. Another angle of attack may be to actually provide that ontological certainty, because as we've observed before, extremist groups must um, pretend to be able to, must give the impression that, or the hope that they can fulfill that, but they can never actually fulfill it. Otherwise, they no longer have a purpose. If you can fulfill that ontological uncertainty, and there's ways of doing that, most certainly, ways of living and ways of conceptualizing the world where you do have a purpose, right? Then you take away their value, you take away their weight, and may completely collapse the movement in itself. So that's where my head's at thus far. Still doing my AI upskilling, learning how that technology works and so forth, and the limits thereof, though it's starting to get pretty damn maths heavy now that we're into neural networks. But keeping on, keeping on. Biggest challenge right now with the PhD is really just unclear on whether I'm doing enough reading. It is a bit of a balance between deep comprehension of the material and getting through a volume of material. I mean, I'd get through stuff faster if I skimmed it, but am I going to get the same appreciation for the material? I don't know. But, we just keep on keeping on really at this point. I think we're on track, feeling pretty good about it. Starting to develop some hypotheses about how this could all go down. Um, but yeah, I'll get into the ethics and the power dynamics in a subsequent one of these, and we'll go forward from there. We can start to look at how this might all come together. All right, till next week.